Hello fellow TubeTubers, hope you're all well. So we're going to be going through language paper 2. The topic for this paper we're going through is poverty, and we're going to go through all of the questions during this lesson. Don't forget, I will have the timings down below in the description bar so you can skip to specific questions if you just want to look at specific questions. But if you want to go through the whole of the lesson, let's get going. So let me just remind you about language paper 2. The difference between language paper 2 and language paper 1 is that language paper 2 looks at non-fiction texts. And with that, they look at 2 extracts, and the questions are quite different to language paper 1. The first question will ask you to sort of select the correct information from 4 statements in paper 2. The second question in language paper 2 will ask you to summarize the 2 texts, looking at either similarities or differences on one specific aspect of the text. The third question will ask you to analyze language, similar to question 2 in language paper 1. The fourth question will ask you to compare the writer's viewpoints. The fifth question will then ask you to produce a piece of non-fiction writing or transactional writing yourself. So you're either going to write to persuade, to inform, to advise, etc. But I'll go through all that in this lesson. Now, another thing that you might want to take note of is the difference in marks between language paper 1 and language paper 2. Just like language paper 1, question 1 is 4 marks in language paper 2. Question 2 is 8 marks, just like language paper 1 as well. Now, question 3 in language paper 2 is 12 marks, whereas in language paper 1, it is only 8 marks. And question 4 is 16 marks in language paper 2, whereas in language paper 1, it's 20 marks. So there's a slight difference in the markings for question 3 and 4 in particular. So just remember that. So you'll be expected to analyze language in more detail in question 3, language paper 2, than you would do in language paper 1, question 2. I hope that all makes sense. Now, just to let you know, in the description bar below, I also have the link to this whole lesson as a PDF available for you to access. And I've also linked the techniques that you might need to know as an additional PDF as well. So let's start with question 1. Before we actually answer the question, you need to read both of the texts. So I'm going to read source A to you first, and then we've got 5 words I'd like you to define. In this extract, James Mahoney describes what he saw when he travelled around Southern Ireland during the Irish potato famine of 1847. I started from Cork by the mail for Skibbereen and saw little until we came to Clonakilty, where the coach stopped for breakfast. And here, for the first time, the horrors of the poverty became visible in the vast number of famished poor who flocked around the coach to beg alms. Amongst them was a woman carrying in her arms the corpse of a fine child, and making the most distressing appeal to the passengers for aid to enable her to purchase a coffin and bury her dear little baby. This horrible spectacle induced me to make some inquiry about her, when I learned from the people of the hotel that each day brings dozens of such applicants into the town. After leaving Clonakilty, each step that we took westward brought fresh evidence of the truth of the reports of the misery, as we either met a funeral or a coffin at every 100 yards until we approached the country of Shepperton Lakes. Here the distress became more striking from the decrease of numbers at the funerals, none having more than 8 or 10 attendants, and many only 2 or 3. We next reached Skibbereen. We first proceeded to Bridgetown, and there I saw the dying, the living, and the dead lying indiscriminately upon the same floor, without anything between them, and the cold earth, save a few miserable rags upon them. To point to any particular house as a proof of this would be a waste of time, as all were in the same state, and not a single house out of 500 could boast of being free from death and fever, though several could be pointed out with the dead lying close to the living for the space of 3 or 4, even 6 days, without any effort being made to remove the bodies to a last resting place. After leaving this abode of death, we proceeded to High Street or Old Chapel Lane, and there found one house, without door or window, filled with destitute people lying on the bare floor, and one fine, tall, stout country lad, who had entered some hours previously to find shelter from the piercing cold, lay here dead amongst others likely soon to follow him. The appeals to the feelings and professional skill of my kind attendants here became truly heartrending, and so distressed Dr. Donovan that he begged me not to go into the house and to avoid coming into contact with the people surrounding the doorway. A specimen of the indoor horrors of school may be seen in the annexed sketch of the hut of a poor man named Mullins, who lay dying in a corner upon a heap of straw supplied by the relief committee, while his 3 wretched children crouched over a few embers of turf as if to raise the last remaining spark of life. This poor man, it appears, had buried his wife for some 5 days previously, and was, in all probability, on the eve of joining her, when he was found out by the untiring efforts of the vicar, who for a few short days saved him from that which no kindness could ultimately avert. Our artist assures us that the dimensions of the hut do not exceed 10 feet square, adding that, to make the sketch, he was compelled to stand up to his ankles in the dirt and filth upon the floor. So if you want to pause the video and read it again, feel free to. But I'd like you to have a look at these 5 words: famish, spectacle, induce, abode, and assure. Pause the video and get the definitions of these words now. Okay, so you should have got famish is extreme hunger, spectacle a visually striking performance or display, induce succeed in persuading or leading someone to do something, abode a place of residence, assure tell someone something positively to dispel any doubts. Now we're going to have a look at the second source. Source B. This extract looks at the plight of farmers in a newspaper article of 2011. We must not ignore the plight of our farmers. Rowena Davies reports on one farmer's struggle to cope. Dave is not his real name. He's too scared to tell me that in case his family farm becomes a target for animal rights activists just because he agrees with the government's plan to cull badgers as a way of stopping the spread of tuberculosis, a serious disease in cattle. He's been a farmer in Devon for over 50 years. His family works an exhausting 14 hours a day, 7 days a week to look after their dairy herd of 1,000 cows, nursing them through birth and hand-feeding them when they're sick. When Dave started farming 50 years ago, he used to shoot badgers and none of his cows suffered from TB. When badgers became a protected species, he stopped shooting them. Now there are badgers on his land and regular cases of TB in his herd. This picture is being repeated at a national level. TB is now devastating herds of cattle across the countryside. In 1998, fewer than 6,000 cows were killed because they had TB. In 2011, the figure rose to 34,000. To deal with the huge number of cattle being infected with TB, the government is planning to allow farmers to shoot badgers. It believes that badgers are responsible for spreading this devastating infection that is killing cattle and driving farmers out of business. Science is very much on the side of culling badgers because TB was under control in the 1970s and 1980s and has only become a problem since 1992 when it was made illegal to kill badgers. Since then, the badger population has grown considerably and TB in cows has increased dramatically. Farmers don't want to kill all badgers, just those that have TB, says Dave. It's only when their numbers get out of control that they start causing infections. Because they have no natural predators, it's up to us to keep the numbers down or they take over. Working so closely with infected animals meant that Dave's son-in-law came down with TB himself. His family stood by as he lay in bed rapidly losing weight and coughing, but they still want to keep going. My family want to carry on farming, says Dave. They love it and their children love it. It's in our blood. Animal rights groups and charities say that the answer is vaccines, but there is no suitable vaccine for cows. The National Farmers Union says vaccinating badgers is incredibly difficult because to be effective, each badger has to be caught in a cage and needs to be vaccinated once every year for 4 years. This makes it a very expensive operation. It's difficult to explain how difficult life in the countryside already is. Back in Devon, one of Dave's neighbours has recently gone out of business. The price of milk paid to farmers has been slashed by 4p a litre this year, and supermarkets now sell milk at barely the cost of production. It's been too wet to graze the cows outside, so feed supplies have been used up and the increased price of grain is hitting farmers hard. Britain has lost 40% of its dairy farms over the last 10 years and TB is increasing that percentage every year. Something has to be done. So again, feel free to pause the video now and read it again, but you must define the following 5 words: activist, cull, vaccine, species and graze. Pause the video now and get on with that task. Okay, so activist is a person who campaigns to bring about political or social change. Cull is to reduce the population by selective slaughter. Vaccine is a substance that stimulates antibodies to provide immunity against one or several diseases. Species is a group of living organisms with similar individuals capable of exchanging genes or interbreeding, and graze just means to feed on. Right, so let's start with question 1. It says read the highlighted section. Shade the 4 statements below that are true. Pause the video now. Read through the statements and reread through the highlighted section and select which letters you believe are true. Okay, so you should have got B, he stopped for breakfast in Clonakilty. C, a lady is begging for money for a coffin for her dead child. E, the writer stopped at Shepperton Lakes. And F, the writer went to Bridgetown in Skibbereen. Now let's have a look at question 2. So what I have is both of the extracts side by side here, just to make life a bit easier for the task. The question is to write a summary of the similarities of those people who are suffering in these 2 extracts. So my task for you is to find quotations to support the following statements. So you need to find quotes in both of the articles that support the statement. So the first statement is that both articles are about conditions in rural areas and elements of suffering that are being faced. So see if you can find a quote in source A and source B that supports that statement. Number 2 is both articles use statistics, expert opinion and eyewitness accounts to evidence the plight of the local people. So see if you can find evidence of either a statistic, an expert opinion or eyewitness account in both of them. Number 3, both articles look at cases of illness and near-death situations. See if you can find a quote in both that support that statement. And number 4, both articles use description to highlight the issues being faced. Pause the video now, spend no more than 7 minutes on this task, and you're just going to write down a quote from each of the sources that link to the 4 statements. So, what I've done here is I have created a table and I've filled out the majority of it for you. However, I don't want you to feel as if you have to use my quotations. You have probably got better quotes than me, but these are here just in case you struggled with finding any of the statements. So, what you want to do in question 2 is you want to identify the similarity because the question itself asks you for the similarities. Obviously, you'd look for differences if it asked you to look at the differences of the people suffering. Then you want to find a quote in each of the sources and then you want to make an inference. If you can find 4 different similarities, a quote from each source and make an inference, that will be a high level mark. So that's why I've created this table to show you more or less what a response needs to look like. So I've completed the first row for you. My similarity is that both articles are about conditions in rural areas and elements of suffering that are being faced. So I've looked at the quotes famished poor and one of Dave's neighbours has recently gone out of business. My inference is that both sources show that a lack of money is causing their suffering. Source A suggests that they're unable to access basic necessities and source B shows a loss of someone's livelihood. So my inference is pretty straightforward, but it just explains it a bit more as to why I've chosen those quotes. I would like you to do exactly the same. If you have your own quotations for the other points, however, use yours, don't bother use mine. Okay? I want you to spend no more than 10 minutes on this task, so pause the video now and have a go at it. Okay, so now we're going to be writing up our response. So we're using everything we got from this table and we're putting it into a detailed response. You want to try and write at least 3 paragraphs. So we're writing a summary of the similarities of those people who are suffering in these 2 extracts. And I've put my example into a paragraph for you to show you what it looks like. So what I've said is both articles are about conditions in rural areas and elements of suffering that are being faced. In source A, the writer makes reference to the famished poor, which shows that the majority of citizens were suffering because they had no food or money to support themselves. Similarly, in source B, the reader is informed that one of Dave's neighbours has recently gone out of business, which implies that due to the environment, the business owner has suffered a loss of income, which has affected his future. Both sources show that a lack of money is causing their suffering. Source A suggests that they are unable to access basic necessities, and source B shows a loss of someone's livelihood. So in this paragraph, I have identified a quote from source A and explained how it links to the question. The same for source B, and I've summarised what both sources tell you about the topic and I've made an inference. So what I'd like you to do now is turn your table into 3 paragraphs, and I want you to spend no more than 15 minutes on this task. Pause the video now and get on with it. By the way, if you've finished, try and identify where you have met the success criteria, which is at the bottom left hand side of the screen. Okay, so now we're going to look at question 3. So this is the one that would be 12 marks in the actual exam. Refer only to source B, so you'll always only be looking at source B in this extract. The newspaper article on the plight of farmers. How does the writer use language in this article to present her views on the plight of farmers? So what I'd like you to do is 4 things for me. I want you to identify any facts and figures, emotive language, a serious tone, and language to create sympathy that links to the the writer and her views on the plight of farmers. I would like you to spend no more than 7 minutes on this task. Just write down any quotes that you think link to each of the ideas. Pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so I've looked at a couple of quotes for facts and figures. I've looked at where it says 6,000 cows and then how the figure rose to 34,000. Emotive language, I've looked at where it said he's too scared to tell me, and also where it says this devastating infection that's killing cattle. For serious tone, I've looked at the last sentence, something has to be done. And for language to create sympathy, I've looked at the part where it says it's in our blood and that the milk paid to farmers has been slashed by 4p a litre. If you found your own examples, you don't need to use these ones, but if you struggled with any, please make sure you write them down. Okay, so I'll put this into another table. And for question 3, you want to have your quote, you want to identify techniques, and you want to make an analysis. You also want to think about the effect on the reader as well. So I've completed the first row for you. So the quotes that I've looked at is he's too scared and devastating infection. So I'm looking at emotive language using adjectives. So my analysis is that the use of shock and emotive language to describe the farming conditions in Devon, particularly shown in the use of the anonymous farmer, shows that the writer is on the side of the farmers and empathises with them and the situation they are in. Okay, what I'd like you to do is complete the table, writing an analysis for the other 3 quotes or any other quotes that you have used that are probably better than mine. Spend about 10 minutes on this task. Pause the video now. Okay, so now we're going to write up our question 3. You want to try and aim for 3 to 4 paragraphs for this question. Just to let you know, in terms of the success criteria, you want to include examples of a quote, fewer than 3 words, zooming in on a 1-word quote, identifying a technique or word class, using a word such as suggests or implies to make an inference, explore the emotional impact of a quote on the reader or character, and link the quote to the overall ideas or meanings of the text. So here is my response that I've written up using what I've written down in this table. Firstly, the writer includes the use of shock and emotive language to describe the farming conditions in Devon. The writer begins by describing the subject to whom the article is based on and gives him an alias by the name of Dave, whilst explaining the reason for this, he's too scared. The adjective scared implies the fear of the impact it would have on him if he was to be open about who he is. The writer intends to protect his identity to shield him from any unnecessary consequences. Additionally, the writer explains the devastating infection that is killing the cattle. The adjective devastating forces the reader to sympathise with not only the cattle but the farmers, as the infection is ruining their livelihood. Okay, so as you can see, I've developed my explanation a lot more in this paragraph than what I did in the table. So I'd like you to have a go at this. I want you to spend no more than 20 minutes on this response. Pause the video now and attempt to write 3 paragraphs. Okay, so let's look at question 4. Right, question 4 is looking at both source A and source B. So I've done 2 slides where you can look at both of the sources. So it says compare how the 2 writers convey their views on the suffering of those described in these 2 extracts. You could compare their views about the suffering of those they're describing, compare the methods the writers use to convey their views, and support your ideas with quotations from both texts. So what I'd like you to do is you're going to pause the video and spend 5 minutes try and find 4 quotes from source A, looking at the writer's opinion on the topic, which is the suffering, seeing if there's the formality of the extract, is it formal or informal, the tone and the mood of each extract, what tone and mood is portrayed, and find quotes that sort of present that tone or mood. So 5 minutes to try and find 4 quotes. Pause the video now. So you're now going to do exactly the same thing with source B. Try and identify the writer's opinion on suffering, the formality of the extract, and the tone and mood of the extract as well. 5 minutes on that. Pause the video now. Okay, so you should have got 4 quotes for source A and for source B. Now, what I've got here is quite a large table here. It looks at both sources. So in each source, it looks at what views they have, a quote to support that view, and space to identify method and analyze that quote. And then at the end it says S or D, meaning similar or different. Because we're comparing, we have to identify whether they're similar or they're different. So I have completed the first row for you, and I've also given you a method and analysis for the second row, but you have to find the quote to support that analysis and what views they have. So the first view in source A is that the writer views the suffering they face as a serious issue. The quote I've used is, not a single house out of 500 could boast of being free from death. My method and analysis is that statistics show that all houses visited have experienced death. This sparks emotions of sorrow and sympathy as they are at serious risk. In source B, the writer understands the farmers' actions and the distress all of them face nationally. The quote is that this picture has been repeated at a national level. I've said imagery used to provide reasoning for Dave having to shoot the badgers prior to this, and the negative outcome for him after the badgers became a protected species. And I've said that this is similar because they're both on the sides of the people they are representing. So the views are similar because they both understand the suffering that they are experiencing and why they're experiencing it. So I'd like you to look at the next row where it says Mahoney's extract is diary-like and highly descriptive in form, with a degree of formality and a certain degree of remoteness. See if you can find a quote to show that it's quite formal, and also see if you can explain what views they have. Why has the writer chosen to write in such a formal way? Source B is a newspaper article and is more informal and anecdotal, so it's more like kind of like a story, and it's not very formal, quite informal, quite casual. So I want you to find a quote that shows this, and then identify why the writer has chosen to write in an informal tone, and then obviously that's going to be different, and maybe explain why it's different. Then you're going to identify 2 more quotes and analyze in exactly the same way. You might want to spend up to 15 minutes on this task because it is quite complex. So pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so now we're going to try and write up our response. So in question 4, you want to include a quote, zooming in on a quote, identifying a method, using a word such as suggests or implies for inference, look at the effect on the reader, link to the question, and identify a similarity or difference using connectives. So here's my example. Both extracts explore negative views on the suffering of those described. These views are similar as they are both explicitly showing the reader that they are on the sides of the people they are representing. In the first extract, the writer explains the suffering the people face and portrays it as a serious issue. This is evident when it says, not a single house out of 500 could boast of being free from death. Here the writer uses statistics, 500, to reveal that all houses visited have experienced death. This sparks emotions of sorrow and sympathy as they are at a serious risk. Likewise, the writer in source B shows an understanding of the farmers' actions and the distress all of them face nationally. This is evident when it says, this picture has been repeated at a national level. Here, imagery is used to provide reasoning for Dave having to shoot the badgers prior to this, and the negative outcome for him after the badgers became a protected species. Now it's your turn to have a go at writing 3 paragraphs using the table that you created. Spend no more than 20 minutes on this question. Pause the video now. Okay, so now we're going to look at question 5. So, as mentioned before, we're looking at transactional writing, so it's going to be a lot different to Language Paper 1, question 5. However, what is still applicable are the techniques that are used in creative writing in general. The sentence starters, the punctuation, the figurative language, the sentence types, that is still applicable. So if you haven't looked at my lesson on question 5, please go back, it's linked below, and have a look at it because it's still relevant to question 5 in Language Paper 2. However, in Language Paper 2, what you also want to include are some rhetorical devices or persuasive techniques. And these are here. Usually you might have heard of the acronym DAFORIST, and this is basically it. So we've got direct address, alliteration, facts, opinions, rhetorical questions, emotive language, statistics, and 3, or rule of 3. And what I've got here is the definition, some examples, and the effect on the reader as well. So pause the video now and make notes if there are any that you're unsure of. Okay, so for Language Paper 2, question 5, you will be required to use language for impact and will have to either write to explain, write to instruct or advise, write to argue, or write to persuade. And this will need to be written in the form of either a letter, an article, a speech, an essay, or a leaflet. And in the article I've said broadsheet or tabloid. You may have those words in there, and what that does is tells you exactly what form you need to write in. So a broadsheet will need to be more formal, and tabloid can be written in more of a casual tone. So what I have here is I've got what to include in each form. On the left hand side I have an example, and you feel free to pause the video, have a read of it and look what's included in it, but I'm not going to read through it because it's pretty self-explanatory. However, on the right hand side, I've just got what you should be doing as a minimum for each form, and in order to add more detail, you could include the following. So for a letter, at minimum, you need to have an indication that someone is sending the letter to someone, and you need to have paragraphs. To add more detail, you want to include the use of address, a date, a formal mode of address, for example, dear Sir, Madame, or named recipient, effectively, fluently sequence paragraphs, an appropriate mode of sign-off, for example, yours sincerely or yours faithfully. And you can see that on the left-hand side in the example. That's a detailed or developed version of a letter. Pause the video if you need to make notes. We're going to move on. Next is an article. At minimum, you should include the use of a simple title and paragraphs. More detailed, you want to have an original title, maybe a strap line, subheadings if you can, an introductory or overview paragraph, effectively, fluently sequenced paragraphs, formal language for broadsheets and informal language for tabloids. So as you can see on the left hand side, we've got an example. The only thing it doesn't have in this one is subheadings, but again, it's only if it's applicable. Pause the video if you need to make notes, and then move on. Next, we've got an essay. As a minimum, students should include a simple introduction and conclusion and paragraphs. For more detailed or developed responses, you could include an effective introduction and convincing conclusion, effectively, fluently link paragraphs to sequence a range of ideas. Look on the left hand side for an example. Pause the video if you need to. Then we have a speech. As a minimum, you should include a simple address to an audience, sections, a final address to an audience. And when I say address, I mean you sort of talking to them and closing off as well, directly referring to them. More detailed responses should include a clear address to an audience, effective fluently linked sections to indicate sequence, rhetorical indicators that an audience is being addressed throughout, a clear sign off, for example, thank you for listening or something like that. And on the left hand side is an example for you. Pause the video if you need to. Finally, we have a leaflet, and at minimum you should include the use of a simple title and paragraphs or sections. More detailed responses could include a clear original title, organisational devices such as inventive subheadings or boxes, bullet points, effectively, fluently sequenced paragraphs. So on the left hand side you can see that there are some subheadings there, some sections to kind of indicate that there is a leaflet. One thing I wouldn't do that is on the left hand side is the image, because you won't have time in the actual exam. But that's just an example if you wanted to practice. So we're going to attempt to write an article today. So you're going to be given a topic and will be asked to write an article focusing solely on the chosen topic. In this case, it says on the top right of the screen, parents and teachers expect children to work far too hard at school and at home. Young people should be allowed to have fun while they still can. Write an article for a broadsheet newspaper in which you explain your point of view. So that is the task. So the same advice that I gave for language paper 1 is there, the 4 bullet points. I've also put the grid at the bottom with punctuation marks, sentence starters and language devices you can use. And on the left hand side I've included the persuasive devices that you can also use for your article. I would like you to spend 45 minutes attempting to write the article. Pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so just to close off, I have got an example response, and what I want you to do is I want you to compare yours to mine and see how you can improve your response. So maybe you want to write your response again after listening to mine. So it says, as a student myself, I understand the demands from pressuring parents and tyrannical teaching standards. I understand the culture of targets, setting and getting, revision boosters, after school one-to-ones. I know that these systems are in place to support and help me develop. I recognise that my teachers only want to foster my good habits. So why is this all going so horribly wrong? Why are students rejecting the support so freely offered? The fact is, this is not support. It is a demand, an instruction. Importantly, we must first recognise that a student is also a human. More importantly, this human being has the same wants for their own success as the parents, teachers and mentors that encircle them like birds of prey. The reality is that support is not always supportive, and young people have lost the ability to self-manage. We are all looking against one another, and ultimately it is the student that loses out. Almost a third of GCSE and A-level students find that the constant pushing from both school and home leaves them feeling drained and less motivated to revise and put in effort. The majority wanted more independence when it comes to studying because they want to, not because of being overloaded with unrealistic expectations and pre-decided careers. In recent years, the pressures and expectations has grown like a snowball tumbling down a hill. The further it falls, the bigger it gets, and the more of an impact it has at the end. But we must stop this snowball before it falls too far down that hill and crashes with irreversible impacts on its victims. These victims are our sons, our daughters, and our students. Does a duty of care not extend into trying to ease the pressure off of our children? Why should we abuse this position of trust and use it to unintentionally degrade our students' mentality? What right do we have to steer them down the paths that we regret not taking? The pressure and constant prodding is spreading around each school like an abnormal growth of cells, a malignant tumour invading neighbouring tissue, poisoning organs until they're unable to function on their own. Is this what we want for our future generation? A country that has to be reminded to do things, a country unable to think for itself? Because unless this unsettling tumour is treated now, it's going to continue to grow. And when we finally realise our fatal mistake, it will be too late. So what I want you to do is first of all try and identify what techniques I've used, what persuasive devices, and also what different sentence starters, punctuation, etc. I have used, and then see what you could include in yours to make it just as persuasive or even more persuasive than mine. I just want to say thank you very much if you managed to watch the whole of the video or even some of it. I've really enjoyed producing this lesson for you, and I hope that it helps. Let me know if there's anything that you'd like to request in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I will speak to you soon. Bye!